I'm Himan Folskey. I live in Lincoln, Nebraska. I was born in Lincoln, Nebraska on May the 21st, 1917. And my first house that I can recall was at the 20th and S in Lincoln, which at that time was a little Jewish section with my cousins, the Abrams, at one end of the street. Some people by the name of Sockman also in that area, and some Kushner family, among others. And as we grew up in that area for a few years, eventually we moved to a place called 700 South 27th here in Lincoln. And about that time I started into the Elliott grade school, and thereafter went to a junior high school called 26th and O, which was a small junior high school with a small playground and some very good teachers. And thereafter I went on to Lincoln High School, where I graduated. In the meantime, before that, I, like other youngsters in the Jewish community, started to go to Hebrew school and went there Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. And of course, on Sunday we went to Sunday school, and frankly, as a matter of fact, sometimes would even go to Saturday morning services when my father might have gone. My growing up in Lincoln was not very unusual. It was a lot of fun. There were swimming pools. I recall my father buying me a bicycle when I was about 8 years or 9 years old. I drove it to the swimming pool, and as luck would have it, I didn't lock it, and so it was stolen by someone. So I was without this new bicycle for some time. My father wasn't very happy with me that I didn't lock the bicycle, but those things happen when you're young. After high school, I went on to the University of Nebraska and eventually graduated from law school in the June of 1940. And then I decided, together with two of my friends, a fellow by the name of Aaron Finkelstein and a friend by the name of Irva Green, to go to Washington, D.C. To look for jobs. Well, that didn't turn out too well too long, because by May of 1941, I received my draft notice in Washington, D.C., and was inducted in Washington, D.C., going on from there to Richmond, Virginia, to Camp Lee, Virginia. But before that, it was about 4:30 in the morning when I was boarding a bus to go to the induction station in Washington, D.C., and some other fellow got on the bus also with a little satchel like I was carrying, and we greeted each other and soon discovered that we were going to the same place to be inducted. Now, the only reason I mention that is that, believe it or not, approximately 4 years later, while I was still in the service, at that time was stationed at what was then Hotel Stevens in Chicago. He was going in the hotel, I was coming out, and he stopped for a moment, took a look at me and said, "Don't I know you?" I said, "Well, I don't know." He said, "Well, where are you from?" I said, "Well, I'm from Lincoln, Nebraska originally." And I said, "Where are you from?" He said, "Washington, D.C." And I said, "Oh, I'm from Washington, D.C. Oh." And it didn't take long till we recognized that 4 years later I had seen this man for the first time since the time we were riding on that bus to be inducted. After induction in Washington, D.C., as I said, I was sent to Camp Lee, Virginia for the complete physical examination. And as I had finished my physical, I sat down on a bench, took a look over to my right, and I saw another fellow sitting there who looked a little older than those of us who were being inducted. So I moved over to him and I said, "Were you drafted?" And he said, no. I said, well, what are you doing here? He said, well, I have decided to volunteer, and I want to get into the Fort Leavenworth, where they have the cavalry. I said, oh, I'm not too far from there. I live in Lincoln, Nebraska. Well, he said, that's nice. And I said to him, are you married? He said, yes. And I said, do you have any children? He said, yes, I have two. Well, I said, we're only going to get $21 a month. How are you going to support them? And he said, well, my family lives on a farm in Virginia. And about that time, I ended the conversation and moved away from him. Shortly thereafter, the Richmond Times-Dispatch newspaper was brought into the area by a young man who was selling them. So for a dime, I bought a newspaper. I opened up the newspaper, and lo and behold, it turned out to be Andrew Mellon III. And I thought to myself, my golly, I'm worried about he and his children. Andrew Mellon III, you know, is the grandson or the son of a multi-millionaire. They own the Gulf Oil, they own Pittsburgh Steel, they own, well, you name it. To make a long story short, his father had given $25 million to the establishment of the Mellon Art Institute in Washington, D.C. Now, the reason that I call this to your attention is that about 15 years later, on Time magazine, this man's picture appeared, and there was a big article about him, and in the article, he mentioned the young man that had asked him about his desire to join the service, and this young man was worried about what my wife and my children would do. I intended to write him, to tell you the truth, but I didn't. My wife suggested I do so, but I didn't. But that was an interesting episode. Then, of course, after induction at Camp Lee, I spent my basic training there, and then we were shipped to the maneuvers in the Carolinas in late November, early November actually, where we ran around pretending to shoot people and hit tanks and all that sort of thing. And then we were sent back on the morning of December the 7th, 1941, to Camp Lee, Virginia. And we were assigned barracks and all that sort of thing. And I had an aunt in Philadelphia, which wasn't too far from Fort Lee, Virginia. And so I decided to go visit my aunt. And of course, at that time, soldiers were hitchhiking and people would pick you up. But as I got to Trenton, New Jersey, out of the clear sky, the MPs were coming up and down the streets and so on and ordering everybody to get back to the camps. But the Japanese had attacked Pearl Harbor. And that was on December the 7th, 1941. So, I, like all the other soldiers, hitchhiked rides back to camp, and we were waiting for things to develop. In the meantime, my parents, who lived in Lincoln, Nebraska, got wind of the fact that, well, they knew that the war was starting, and were, of course, fearful that I might be called and sent overseas because I was in the Army and on maneuvers. And so my father and my mother jumped on a train in Lincoln, from Lincoln to Chicago, Chicago to Philadelphia, took a taxi to Fort Dix, New Jersey, and came to visit me over the weekend. And of course their departure was very difficult, especially for my mother, but they left and they eventually went back to Lincoln. And then shortly before December 25th or thereabouts, we were shipped out of Fort Dix, New Jersey, down to New Orleans, to a place where we would embark to go overseas. And the first day we were there, they let us out of the camp, so we went into town and went to the USO, and there we happened to meet some very nice Jewish ladies. And they recognized, or we talked to them a little bit, and they knew we were Jewish. There was another fellow, a friend of mine by the name of Bertie Kotler, and they invited us to dinner. We, of course, accepted, and got back to camp, and lo and behold, the camp had closed. We weren't permitted to leave the camp because we were going to be sent to the ships to get on to leave. And we never got a chance to call those nice ladies to tell them we wouldn't be there for dinner. They still may be waiting, I don't know. So that's the beginning of my Army career. And from there, the ship I was on was loaded with the men, the Army. The other ship that was following us was a ship that was loaded with our equipment. And in the Caribbean, as we were sailing through there, a German submarine luckily hit the ship that had the equipment on it. We got away, and the ship went down with our equipment. So they had to stop, and we got off in Panama with no equipment except the individual guns that we carried. And so they put us in the jungles in Panama for a while. And eventually then we left there and went into the Pacific. And I was there for a long time. And among other soldier friends of mine was a man by the name of Charles O. Porter. And he was a lawyer, had graduated from Harvard, and so when he found out I was a lawyer, that established a little kinship. And we got to know each other very well. And one day he came over to me and he said, "Hi, if we don't get out of here with what's going on, we're never going to get out." So I said to him, "Well, Charlie, what should we do?" He said, "Why don't we apply for officers training school and get out of here?" Well, that's what we did. And whatever we had to do, we were accepted. And then our names were on the captain's desk, and a ship would only come to where we were once a month. One day, Charlie Porter walked into the captain's desk, or the captain's office, and was looking at the desk to see where our names were. And he noticed that Porter and Folskey were on the bottom of the list. There were some other fellows that also applied for OCS. Well, I must tell you, he picked up my name and his name, put it on the top of the list, and the next time the ship came, we got to come back to America, and that was in mid-1944. And we were sent to officers training school in Miami Beach, which is a little different than where we were. And I graduated and became a second lieutenant. And my first assignment, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, was at the Stevens in Chicago with Air Corps Intelligence. That lasted for about 3 months, and then I was shipped to Langley Field, Virginia. And for the first time is when I got into a legal office after all these years. And so I began doing defense work for soldiers who violated the law or violated the code of ethics or something like that. And one case that stands out in my mind with respect to that is that I was defending a man who was charged with possession of marijuana. And the witness who was testifying against him told the court that this man had marijuana and was trying to sell it and so on. Then the prosecuting attorney handed the witness something that looked like a cigarette, but it was a marijuana cigarette apparently. And he said to the witness, "What is this?" And the witness said, "This is a marijuana cigarette." And I objected on the ground that insufficient evidence. So the prosecuting attorney said to the witness, "Would you smoke it? And then can you tell us what it is?" And the witness said, "Yes, I can, but I refuse to smoke anything like that." At that time, my client jumped up and said, "I will." Well, needless to say, I lost the case. And I stayed at Langley Field and did defense work and legal work. And then in May of 1945, or no, 1945, sorry, I got word that I was going to be shipped to Europe. And I was at the port at Hampton, Virginia, and the war in Europe ended. So luckily, they took me off of the ship, and I didn't go to Europe. Now, very briefly, that's the highlight of my so-called Army career. Going back to Lincoln, Nebraska, I came back in 1946 when I got out of the Army, and it didn't take long for a good friend of mine by the name of Leo Hill to get a hold of me and ask me if I would like to become the secretary of the synagogue. And I said, sure. And I served as the secretary of the synagogue and the vice president of the synagogue and 3 years as president of the synagogue, and actually on the synagogue board one way or another for close to 30 years. I also been president of B'nai B'rith. I have been chairman of the Lincoln Jewish Welfare Federation for 7 years and headed campaigns before that and after that. I belong to the Kiwanis here in Lincoln. I have been for a number of years. And roughly speaking, that's my community service. I also served as an election commissioner here in Lancaster County for a while. So far as people in Lincoln are concerned, I've had a number of good friends. And there was Dwayne Kushner, a dear friend of mine that I grew up with. We went into business together until he passed away, and by business I mean some real estate business, because I was practicing law. And I've mentioned Leo Hill, a wonderful fellow. He got me interested in Nebraska football. And to make a long story short, I've had Nebraska football tickets from 1947 up to the present time. Very choice seats, 35 rows up on the 49-yard line. With respect to my wife and family, my wife Betty was from York, Nebraska, and strangely enough, we were introduced through Ruth Marks, the wife of Dr. Lou Marks, and it so happens that Ruth Marks was a sister to Irv Green, one of the men that I went to law school with and went to Washington with. And one day she called me and asked me if I'd like to take out a nice Jewish girl. And so I said, well, that'd be okay. And in the meantime, she called Betty because she knew Betty from Norfolk, Nebraska, where Betty's parents lived before they moved to York, Nebraska. And Betty said, well, I guess so. And so we were to meet after Yom Kippur when her father went to the synagogue, but her mother and Betty used to go to the temple. And so when their service was over, Betty was to come over to the synagogue with her mother, pick up her father, and I was to meet her at that time. Well, I got caught in the front of the synagogue as people were leaving, or in the back of the synagogue, whichever you want to call it, and I didn't get out in time, as Betty was waiting there for a moment or two to not only pick up her father, but waiting to meet me. Well, she started to walk away with her father. She got about a quarter of a block when I looked and I saw that must be the girl I'm supposed to be meeting. And I kind of walked rather fast just to be courteous and to do the right thing, and called out her name. She turned around, and that was the Betty Rosenberg that I eventually married. One of the interesting things was that after we talked and I told her I'd pick her up that night, because in Lincoln at that time there was always a Yom Kippur dance after the fast and so on. And since I had come out of the Army, my ability to get a new car was literally nil, because there were so many people that signed up ahead of me. And so instead of taking my Plymouth, which was about 10 years old, I took my father's new, relatively speaking, new Dodge. And so I drove by with the Dodge in front of the Cornhusker Hotel, picked her up, and she got in the car. And as we were driving away, at that time she smoked. So she took out a cigarette and started to look for the lighter in the Dodge. Well, it wasn't my car, my dad's car. I didn't know where the lighter was. So she looked at me, and in her mind she saw that this wasn't my car. So we fumbled around and we found the lighter. She lit her cigarette, And she's reminded me that for the last 54 years of our marriage. That's with respect to my wife. She's a very unusual woman. I've been practicing law for over 50 years, and I must tell you that during that 50-year period, never once has she failed to get up in the morning to make me breakfast before I would go to work, or have to go to the court, or have to go out of town. You really couldn't ask for a nicer or a better or a more wonderful woman. We have two children. My son Alan, he's a lawyer and lives in Los Angeles, and they have a little boy, 10 years old. My daughter Susan lives in Cleveland. She has a little boy, 10 years old. And the interesting thing is that both little boys were born 1 week apart. So we first flew to Cleveland for the bris for the boy in Cleveland, and then tried to go to Los Angeles for the bris for the boy there. But while we were in Cleveland, Betty became ill and had to go to the hospital, so we missed the bris in Los Angeles. But we went out there later, of course, to see our new grandson. And that sort of comprises the immediate family. I have a sister, Faye Unger, who lives in Lincoln at this time. She's 89 years old. I had a younger brother, Max, who became ill and passed away. So family itself is just my sister and myself, and of course my wife and children. Other people in Lincoln, aside from Leo and Dwayne, there was a fellow by the name of Bob Pittler, who had lived in Lincoln many years. He lived across the street from us for a while. When his 5th child was born, he ran out of names. So Betty and I named his 5th little girl. Then other people, Sheldon Kushner. Oh yes, and I must mention my cousin Everett Evnan and his wife Elaine. Originally she was from Sioux City. Everett's mother was my first cousin, Dorothy Evnan. And she and my father and my aunt Ruth Abrams were the ones that came over to this country in about 1910. Dorothy Evnan at that time was 7 years old, and in later years, as we tried to ask her what was life like in Russia, she was very vague because she left there at age 7, couldn't tell us too much, and we really regret that I didn't probe further with my father about his childhood and their living quarters, his mother, his father. As a result of all that, none of my grandparents did I ever know. None of them ever came over to this country. So I've always missed that, of course, not having grandparents to talk to and visit with and enjoy the benefit of their company. That about tells you everything. I've had an enjoyable time practicing law. I've represented a lot of people, a variety of people, and I've tried a number of cases, won a lot of them, lost a few of them, and had some interesting experiences before judges and before juries. And now I'm semi-retired, and offhand, I'm not sure that I have very much more to tell you.
I'd like to hear a little bit more about your law career, when you came back and went into practice.
Okay, when I came back, obviously I had been away from the law because I graduated in June 1940, and I didn't get back until 1946 from the Army. I was in for 5 years. And so at first I took a job with the Veterans Administration as a lawyer because it gave me a little income. Speaking of income, one of the things that shocked me when I came out of the Army was that I went down to a store here called McGee's, located on 12th and O, to buy some civilian clothing. And when I left for the Army in 1940, a shirt was $2.95, $3.95. When I walked into McGee's to buy a shirt to begin replenishing my clothing, it turned out to be $6.95 or $8.95 for a shirt, which was a real shock to me because I had been out of civilian life for 5 or 6 years. But going on from there, after the work with the Veterans Administration, and I was there a year and a half, at which time I was able, of course, to save a little money because they did pay fairly well. At that time, they began to reduce their staff by eliminating the latest people that they'd hired and kept the old timers. So at that time, I decided it was time for me to go into private practice and see what I could do. And so I found a law office with a fellow lawyer on 11th and O in the old Continental National Bank building. And I set up my law practice there, and I was very fortunate in that some of the Jewish people in Lincoln brought me their law business. One man in particular, whose name I won't mention, would have me do a little legal work with respect to his real estate, but he didn't really want to pay what would be appropriate for drawing up a lease for a client. He would bring me a copy and ask me to copy that and then substitute the names, and then he'd pay me $2.50. Well, since I knew the family and knew him, I went ahead and did that. But then I was lucky in other respects. There was a lady by the name of Ann Gordon, a wonderful lady who was connected with an insurance company here in Lincoln. And one day she called me and said, "Hi, would you like to represent an insurance company that we write policies for?" And I said, "Oh, that would be great." Well, she invited me to meet the president of the company, which I did. And that enabled me really to take off. This insurance company wrote just policies to cover the damage to your car, not public liability. And so if your car was in an accident and the other man was at fault, the insurance company would pay you to cover your damages so your car could get repaired, and then turn the file over to me to go after the person who caused the accident. Well, very often, not only did you have property damage, but sometimes the people whose car was damaged were also personally injured. And so these people eventually would say, "Well, why should I go get a separate lawyer for my personal injury as long as you're going after the car damage? Why don't you take my personal injury case?" Well, that turned out to be what I shall describe as a bonanza, so far as the practice of law was concerned. And of course, that only means that you meet these people, but after that, they remember you if you've done a good job, and if other things come up, if they buy a house, or if they need a contract, or if unfortunately they have a divorce, all those things. What it really did was build a base for my law practice. And then I also was very lucky, a little later on, there was a fellow by the name of Art Gould from Omaha, a very prominent CPA, who introduced me to the Richmond-Gordman family, and I became the attorney for Richmond-Gordman in Lincoln, Grand Island, and Beatrice. And so that led me to corporate activity, among other things. And my law practice here in Lincoln, I also represented a very big owner of Mobile Home Court in Omaha, way out, I don't know that that court is there today, but it was way out near what was then, about 167th and West Dodge, way out in that area. And they had a world of respect for me and insisted I take care of all their legal work, even though I was in Lincoln and they were in Omaha. And then another corporate client I had was a man who owned 4 grocery stores here in Lincoln and had a company that picked up milk from the farmers, delivered it to the dairies, And in addition, he operated a Christmas tree farm. So he had a lot of work for me. And as I said, among my Jewish friends, they brought me a assorted law business. There was a good friend of mine, I forgot to mention his name, Jack Singer, who owned a piece of property on 20th and O that he used for a storage area on the first floor for his auto parts business. And on the second, third, and fourth floor, there was a baby doll manufacturing company. And one Saturday night, we were in the Cornhusker Hotel after having been to a movie or dinner or something. And as we were looking out the Cornhusker Hotel, looking in an eastward direction, we saw a great big fire. And I said, "Oh, Jack, look at that fire." "Oh," he said, "what can we do? Let it burn." Well, we left the hotel after having a bite to eat or whatever we did there, and we drove down N Street, and we looked to the left, and lo and behold, it turned out to be Jack Singer's building that was burning. And so it burned to the ground because the doll factory on the second, third, and fourth floor had ingredients that were flammable, and they just caught fire quickly, and everything burned to the ground. So, of course, Jack hired me to represent him in getting his insurance money, and that was a fairly good battle, very lengthy battle, trying to prove how much damage to the building and how much loss of rent was involved, and what damage there was to his personal property that was on the building. But eventually, after a lot of effort and my learning a great deal with respect to insurance companies, we managed to settle it for a very, very substantial amount, and Jack was forever grateful to me after that. So that takes care of the insurance business and the other business, and I pride myself on one thing. Many years ago, an African American walked into my office and said that he had a personal injury case against the Burlington, that other lawyers didn't want to take his case. And so I said, "Well, give me the facts, and let's talk about it." So he told me what I thought was a good lawsuit. And I took that case and investigated it thoroughly, got in touch, of course, with the doctors, got medical reports, got in touch with the people who saw the accident and whatever caused him to have his difficulty, and eventually, of course, got in touch with the Burlington Northern Railroad. It was Burlington at that time. And we finally entered to a very fine settlement for this African American who was at that time, was about 45 years old. Well, it seems like he spread the word that Mr. Folskey was a lawyer who was honest and who would take your case, and he didn't care whether you were black or white or Chinese or whatever, as long as what you had was truthful. And so, much to my surprise, from time to time, I developed sort of a black clientele. Not a great deal, because we don't have that many people in Lincoln, or that many African Americans in Lincoln. But he always, whenever he could, he sent me somebody, even if they didn't have anything. And I had to tell him, "Well, I'm sorry, but you were in the wrong lane when you made your left turn, or you went through a stop sign, or something like that." But when I told them that and told them why they didn't have a case, they thanked me and said, that's fine. I just wanted to know what's his name sent me here to talk to you. So that makes me feel very good. And the last time that happened was a black lady came in, told me she was involved in an auto accident that her husband was driving the car. And there were not only she, but 4 youngsters sitting in the back seat. And their car was hit. And she told me that there was another lawyer in Lincoln that she had talked to that wouldn't take the case. This lawyer said he didn't think that she had a good case. Well, I listened, and I said, "Okay, your husband got a ticket. maybe you don't have a good case, but from what I can see, it may be that the policeman gave the wrong man the ticket. Let's go to court. I'll try the case before the judge on the ticket. If we lose, then I think we're probably done, because there'll be a judge that'll say, well, you were guilty. But if we win, then I think we can do something. Well, we went to court, we tried it, I won. And so we went ahead with the case, and here were 4 little children in the back of the car that were all injured. She was injured. The husband wasn't injured too badly, but he had a little concussion. Well, to make a long story short, from nothing that she had, when she came to me, we settled it for the 4 children, settled it for the husband, settled it for her, and I guess I did a good job. So that was just another episode in the career. And also, if you'll look behind you, you'll notice up there is a picture where I defended a man charged with first-degree murder. A very interesting case. He killed his son-in-law. They had gotten into a dispute after they both had driven up to Fremont to deliver some cattle. They were farmers. When they on their way back, this son-in-law said, I'm not going to give you your share of the money. And so this man said, well, why not? It's, you know, I raised it, you raised it. Well, he said, you're just an old man, you're a pain in the neck, and you don't deserve this money, and you wouldn't know what to do with it anyway. Well, they got back to the farm, and at that point, my client, eventually became my client, said, I want my share of the money, of several $1,000s. Son-in-law said, no, I'm not going to give it to you. And the son-in-law picked up a fork, you know, a pitchfork, and started to go after my client. Well, my client opened the door of the truck, pulled out a pistol or a gun, and started firing. And so the point is, he pulled the trigger 7 times. From here, the lower left hand, where your heart is, up above, 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 and above, and of course he killed the son-in-law. Well, he was then eventually arrested and charged with first-degree murder, and the court appointed me, at that time, years ago, they didn't have public defender offices. The court would go down a list and pick out a lawyer that he thought was a good trial lawyer, and I guess it was my turn. So he appointed me to defend this man. It was a long trial, 3 weeks. The 3 lawyers on the county attorney's side turned out to be Paul Douglas, who became the Attorney General, Judge Bill Blue, who went to the district court after that, and another one whose name escapes me at the moment, but he later became the federal district attorney in Omaha. It was a bitter battle, but a jury found him not guilty, turned him loose, and so I was a bit of a celebrity, because after that I started getting calls from people in Illinois and in Texas and in Kansas, other men charged with first-degree murder, who wanted to hire me to defend them. But of course I did not accept any of those cases. I had enough. Now, to wind up that little story, when it was all over, I should say before it was over, in order for me to be on my toes, every morning I would have tea and toast for breakfast, a little salad for lunch, and then when I got home about 7 o'clock at night, after the trial was over, that is, that day's trial was over at 4:30, I would want to, of course, review my notes, check the law. So I'd get home about 7 o'clock. Then Betty would have a very modest supper. The idea being I didn't want to get sick, I didn't want to get a stomach ache, I didn't want to catch a cold. I had 3 weeks of horrible duty. Well, the verdict came out. I had won. So I drove home, and I think Betty came to the courthouse because we got a call at my house that the jury was in, and they had a verdict. So after the verdict was announced, that was fine. We got in our car. Oh, incidentally, I said to this man, would you like me to drive you home? He said, no. I've been in prison now since I was arrested. I'm walking home. And he walked home 5 miles to the south of Lincoln. I drove home, of course, and said to Betty, you know, for 3 weeks, I've been starving, literally speaking. Let's go out and really do it up. My little girl, my daughter Susan at that time was about 8 years old, or 10. And she said, wait a minute, Daddy, I want to go with you. Well, instead of going out to a nightclub and have a big steak and have a drink and so on, we went to a hamburger place where I had a hamburger and a Coke, Susan had a hamburger and a Coke, and my little girl had a hamburger and a Coke. That was the way I celebrated my big victory. Aside from that, I then later on accidentally became involved with another murder case. And this was a case in which a man was getting a divorce from his wife. He was older than the woman. He'd been married before, had a big farming operation, and five children by that marriage. Then he married a second time, a younger woman who, at the time he married her, I would say he was about 62, 63. She was probably 38, and they had a child. And then she became impatient on the farm and wanted a divorce. She hired a lawyer at Omaha, which was a tragic mistake, because the lawyer at Omaha wanted 50%, literally speaking, of this man's assets. And here he had worked all his life. He had 5 children, and he just couldn't see giving her 1/2. She was entitled to something, and of course we wanted to support the child that was born, and wanted to give her a reasonable amount and give her alimony and all that sort of thing, but her lawyer was not satisfied with that. That lawyer is practicing in Omaha today, incidentally. But the important part of the story is that one day my client, while this divorce proceedings was going on, at night left near York, Nebraska, and drove to a restaurant about 10 miles west of York. I forgot the name of the town at the moment. Went in to get an evening meal. While he was sitting there, some man approached him and said, Mr. Rowlands, that was his name incidentally, I understand you're having trouble with a divorce. Your wife wants a lot of money. So he said, well, how do you know all that? Well, he says, you know, that's the rumor around town, and she's been talking a little bit and so on. Well, he says, so what? Well, he said, we could help you. So my man, a farmer, an innocent guy of a sort, said, well, what do you mean you can help me? Well, he said, you know what we could do for you? We could pick her up, drive her down to Kansas, and leave her off. And that would teach her a lesson, that you mean business, that you're not going to give her half of your farm and everything else. Well, my man said, well, what would you charge me for something like that? And they said, well, $3,000. $1,000 now, $2,000 after we do it. So he said, well, okay, if you can scare her like that, I'll do it. And he gave him $1,000. Well, he then arranged to pick up the woman who had filed suit for divorce against him, his wife, by telling her he wanted to take her for a ride, and he wanted to show her some new things that he was buying for the farm. The idea being she'd be interested because she was going to get a part of the farm, or half. Well, he picked her up. In the meantime, and then he got in touch with these men, told them where he would be so they could see what she looked like. And it was a cafe out here on West O Street. So they were there. My man picked her up, drove her to that cafe. They saw what she looked like. And then they signaled to him, take her out, and we'll follow you. They did it by going to the bathroom or something. And that's exactly what happened. They everybody got in their cars. My man with this lady driving west on West O went out about 10 miles, turned off, and stopped. And these 2 men jumped out of their car, dragged her out of the car, put her in the trunk of their car. My client left to go back to his farm. They were supposed to take her to Kansas and let her out, but they didn't. Instead, they came back to Lincoln. And apparently they had choked her after they put her in the not the back seat, the the back of the car, the trunk. And actually, we now know that she was alive as they were going by Bryan Hospital out here on 48th. But they didn't stop there, which they could have done, and let her out so she could live. Instead, they kept on going past, went out on 48th, and then hit on Highway 77. And they're pulled off of Highway 77 when they were going west, going north, and took her out and dumped her into a creek after tying her up and making sure she was dead. And then they left. 3 hours later, or 2 hours later, a man was out hunting, and he stumbled on the body. And so, of course, he immediately got in his car, called the police. They came and got her. And then apparently they forgot to take her purse. So they immediately identified her as Mrs. Rowlands. So the police got in touch with, from York, Nebraska. So they got in touch with the police in York. Police in York went to the husband, asked him where his wife was. And he said, well, somebody took her down to Kansas. Well, they didn't take her down to Kansas. She's dead. So eventually, after further investigation, they charged him with first-degree murder. And since I was his lawyer in the divorce matter, he kept me on as his lawyer in this murder case. There was a great temptation to try the case because it was never his intention that she be killed. But in Nebraska, generally speaking, when you hire someone to do something and they commit murder, you're as guilty as they are, generally speaking. And so we finally made a deal with the county attorney, because his case wasn't that strong because of what I've just said. And we entered a plea to second-degree murder, which his family wanted him to do, because at that time the electric chair was very much in the picture if he was found guilty. And so he was given 10 years to life, went to the Nebraska penitentiary, and he was so well thought of there because he was a farmer and good with his hands that they appointed him to redo all of the shower stalls, pardon me, where water wasn't going down into the openings. So he spent most of his life there. And one day they had to take him to the medical school in Omaha for some treatment, and he was going by the state fairgrounds. And he said, hey, boys, why don't you drive in there and let me see what the state fairground looks like? I haven't been there, for a number of years. They said, no, Mr. Rowlands, we can't do that. We'd get in trouble if we did that. So, of course, they took him on to Omaha, and he had his medical treatment and came back. And unfortunately, he died in prison. So that was one of the highlights of my so-called legal career. One time I was selecting a jury, and there was a lady on the jury, and this was a man. This is about the third, the only third criminal case I ever had. And in selecting the jury, talking to this woman about your background, how old you are, where you were born, your education, and one big question was, do you have any prejudice against a man or a person who's been drinking that leads to an accident? She said, no, I don't. So I left her on the jury. Much to my shock, the county attorney took her off of the jury. Well, they have a right to do that. They can have a jury of 18, each side gets 3, and you have 12 left, and you go to trial. At the coffee bar in the courthouse, she came up to me, she said, Mr. Folskey, did you strike me from that jury? I said, no, I didn't. Oh. She said, you mean the county attorney did? And I said, yes. Well, she says, to tell you the truth, I'm glad that I was stricken because I lied to you I had a cousin who was killed in an auto accident as a result of a man being under the influence. And when I told you I didn't have any prejudice, that wasn't true. I do have a lot of prejudice about that. But you didn't take me off, so I feel better that although I lied to you, I wasn't on that jury. Well, because she wasn't on that jury, I won the case. The man was found not guilty of the charges. So those are a little of the highlights of my brief criminal career as a lawyer. It was a lot of fun, and of course a lot of sleepless nights. And then trying civil cases is an entirely different thing. That's another matter. I just finished one about 6 months ago, which is, I think, my last one. I know that's the last one I'm going to try down in Beatrice, Nebraska, where some lady was married to a man for 10 years, and they had 2 children, and then they were divorced. And for 5 years, she lived here in Lincoln, and he paid some child support. Then one day he got in touch with her and said, look, why don't we get back together? And the children need a father. And I think we'll all be better off. So she thought it over. She'd been married to him for 10 years, and she felt at that time he had changed somewhat. And so she went back to living in the house that on a farm that they originally had when they were divorced. And he also convinced her that she should sign receipts showing that each month she got the child support until they got married again. Well, this went on from 1985 to 1997, for 13 years, where they simply lived together. She filed receipts showing got child support, which wasn't true, and nothing ever happened. He never was willing to marry her, always put it off. Well, to make a long story short, she left him. Then she came to me about a year and a half ago with this story. And so I wrote him a letter and told him that we need to do some dividing. We need to settle up on this child support that she didn't get, that you said she did by virtue of the receipts that you convinced her to sign and file month after month, year after year. And we need to take a look at the 120 acres that's without a house, and 60 acres or 40 acres that's got a beautiful home on it. Well, that turned into a long battle. We finally tried it in Beatrice in the district court, and I was lucky there. I got her 220 acres that she was entitled to. We gave him the 40 acres in the house because that had a $200,000 mortgage on it. We didn't want that. And we got 15 years of her personal clothing and got paid for the things that she did for him during that 15 years. And so that wound up, I think, basically my career as a trial lawyer. And that's about it. All I can tell you that I can think of at the moment.
I can really detect in speaking to you today, how much pride you take in what you've done, that you've truly enjoyed it, and that you've been successful at it. I'm not talking about financially, but because you love it so much, your heart has been in it, you've been successful that way.
Well, if that's what I portray, or if that's what I project, I guess that's really very much the case. I've enjoyed it, and as I said, it takes a little luck and hard work, and of course being honest with the people who come to see you, and generally speaking, you can be reasonably successful. And so I guess I've made a nice living for my wife and my children, sent them off to colleges out of the state of Nebraska, cars and this and that, and Israel for the kids when they were, at the age they could, belonging to the USY and all that sort of thing. And spent a lot of time in the synagogue, as I said a few minutes ago, as a secretary, and then the vice president, and the president, and on the board, raising money to finally pay off the mortgage there at the synagogue. All those little things while you're living a normal life in Lincoln, Nebraska. And I might add one thing. Betty and I have some very, very dear friends in Omaha. We started going to Acapulco with Jack Epstein and Edith Epstein many years ago, for a number of years. Well, before that, frankly, with Dwayne and Sylvia Kushner and Jack and Sylvia Singer. And then Edith and Jack Epstein joined us, or vice versa. And that led to eventually a decision to start going to Palm Springs many years ago. And there I met any one of a number of people, the Epsteins and all the Zoobs and the Noggs and just so many that I really I can't name all of them. Bay Epstein and the fellow who owned that little dress shop, not dress shop, but children's shop with Yale Gottsteiner. I know him like I know my own name, but at the moment his name escapes me. So as a result, we've had literally Omaha almost as much as Lincoln from a social point of view. We've been there to parties. As a matter of fact, we just attended a year ago a man who's 90 years old, Leo Meyerson. He also goes to Palm Springs, and we see him and had dinner with him there and there in Omaha. And some of the ladies there's a girl by the name of Sis Adler that I was in school with, and I've known her all these years. We've been good friends. So there are any number of Omaha people that we also know. And, Arlene Hockenberg and what's his name? Well, anyway, Arlene Hockenberg's husband, who've now moved out to California, to Oceanside. So that, in some substances, is my life. I don't recall that I've left out anything unusual.
No, I think you've done a great job. I've enjoyed listening to you, Hi.
Well, thank you.